3, 2, 1. Welcome to Math 119, 312, the mathematics of pandemics. Today we will be hearing about individual responsibility during the COVID-19 pandemic. So take it away.
Hi, my name is Clara Ramirez, and along with Leah Elton and Lauren Zhang, we'll be presenting individual responsibility during COVID-19. So far throughout the semester, we've assumed that governments have a responsibility in mitigating COVID-19, but today we're going to be talking about ethical and philosophical concepts to better understand what the individual's role should be. And additionally, this class is going to be more discussion-based, so what our job is to introduce some concepts to you that will hopefully serve as jumping off points later on in the discussion, and that we hope to have some speakers and some people in the chat speaking as well, whatever you're most comfortable with. So Lauren, take it away.
Awesome. To start off, let's see if that works. Yeah, to start off, I sort of want to show people a clip of The Good Place. Just some context on The Good Place. It is a Netflix show. Oh, no. It is a Netflix show that is basically, there's a few characters that you need to keep in mind. The blonde girl here is named Eleanor. She is currently living on Earth, trying or in an attempt to be a better person. The tall white man that you will see is named Michael, who is a demon who also is trying to push her to be a better person, ironically. And the other character that will probably show up is named Chidi, who is a professor, who is also one of the main characters, and a professor of moral philosophy. And so we sort of want to show this clip to sort of show people, just like get like the philosophical gears turning, and I think it's quite relevant to some of the tools we'll be talking about and philosophical concepts. So let me.
Hello, bartender. One alcohol drink, please. It's my birthday if you want to give it to me for free. I always say that, but it actually is my birthday. Last year on my birthday, I almost died. And then I did a bunch of stuff that was good, but weird. And then I stopped. And now I'm here.
Sounds like you had a pretty crazy year. Want to talk about it?
And in the end, Anthony Anderson and Jerry O'Connell started a successful shampoo company. And you see the kangaroo jumping around Australia. That is the plot to the movie Kangaroo Jack. Why did I tell you that?
It's unclear.
You know, the thing is, the problem really with being a do-gooder?
What's that?
No one cares. I mean, some people care a little bit. The twerpy little twerps from the environmental place, they care. But I was a good person for 6 months. That's like 5 years. And it felt okay, but not as good as I thought it would. And what did I get for it?
Ah, see, now you're talking about moral desert.
Exactly. Wait, I am what?
Moral desert is the concept that if you act with virtue, you deserve a reward.
Right. If I'm not gonna get rewarded somehow with like a tiara or one of those diagonal word belts.
Sash.
Sure. Then why should I do good things?
You know, I had a friend that said whenever she was doing something bad, she'd hear this little voice in her head, distant little voice saying, "Oh, come on now. You know this is wrong." And then when she started doing good things, that voice went away. It was a relief.
Your friend sounds like she's one pickle short of a pickle party.
She was a little rough around the edges, but she was also a really good person when she tried. See, I think that little voice was her conscience trying to guide her in the right direction.
I gotta go home. What do I owe ya?
The real question, Eleanor, is what do we owe to each other?
What? Did I sell you a drink? Am I a bartender?
Drinks are on me. Good luck.
Ow.
Anybody notice how it's going?
Nope.
What do we owe to each other? That is the question Tim Scanlon asked decades ago, and it is the question I will try to answer over the next 3 hours.
Ugh, no thanks.
We all have a voice in our head. That voice doesn't tell us what to do or not do, but it does warn us when we do things that don't feel good or right. The difference between reasonable. What does it mean to be a reasonable person? I may have a different definition of reasonable. So why do it then? Why choose to be good every day if there is no guaranteed reward we can count on now or in the afterlife? I argue that we choose to be good because of our bonds with other people and our innate desire to treat them with dignity. Simply put, we are not in this alone.
Hey, dog bait, didn't you get my message? Let's go, time is booze.
All right. Okay, so the clip of The Good Place has a few key takeaways philosophically, and talks about a few philosophical concepts, such as just generally why I choose to be a good person. And then Michael introduces the concept of moral desert, which is getting a reward for doing good moral things. Also introduces the concept of a moral compass / conscious. But the thing I'll be focusing on in the next few minutes is Chidi's conclusion, which talks about contractualism. And Chidi argues that we choose to be good because of our bonds with other people and our innate desire to treat them with dignity. And so contractualism is a philosophical concept coined by Scanlon, mostly, in his book, What Do We Owe to Each Other? And the core concept of contractualism is that an act is wrong if its performance under circumstances will be disallowed by principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for uninformed, unforced general agreement. So to boil it down, essentially contractualism has a few tenets. Firstly, the authority of morality, what determines morality, is this informed, unforced general agreement by reasonable people. And so whatever determines what is right and what is wrong is this mutual recognition. So, but also in specific, contractualism talks about wrongness as the basis, not rightness as the basis for morality. So it talks specifically about wrong acts and what constitutes something being wrong, versus what is the right thing that we should strive for. And so in some, contractualism essentially is claiming or a morality that is based on what things are wrong when people think that they're wrong, under general agreement. And so when talking about this in relation to individual responsibility during the time of COVID, a lot of questions might arise, such as one, the link between it and individualism. And so contractualism has some room for individualism, but a lot of more room for collectivism. So contractualism as a concept essentially states if a principle, some sort of rule, let's say mask wearing or something, imposes a certain burden B1 on me personally, but every alternative imposes a greater burden B2 on someone else, then B1 does not give me any reason to reject that principle. So if I'm reasonable, then my lesser burden will be withdrawn in light of a greater burden on someone else. And so where individualism exists is my burden does matter, but it is just relative to other burdens. So technically, greater needs of others really outweigh individual needs when you're trying to determine what act is wrong. And so in talking about risk, contractualism really staunch contractualism doesn't have any room for risk. It really states that if harm is absolutely certain for a B2 burden for someone else, that the activity cannot happen because the burden of that one person just makes it wrong. So an example I wrote in here is if I ask someone to punch them and their answer would be no, that would hurt me, that B2 burden is greater, right? I just flat out will say I won't. There is no room for me to say like, oh, punching you would make me happy, because contractualism isn't utilitarian. It's not net positives versus like negatives. It is also not rightness based. So you're not trying to argue for what is better, just like what isn't allowed. And finally, like some ideas with the contractualism and COVID comes when we try to make the mutual consensus, right? Like when we try to make the morality decision on whether something is wrong, some complications arise in determining when exactly people make the decision, because it's based on mutual recognition and not necessarily just the objective sort of like set. The timing of decision really does matter, and when something is wrong. So ex ante contractualism essentially states that you decide before things happen, just like weighing the risks, and that sort of has the effect of being relatively utilitarian. But if ex post contractualism is after weighing all the risk and seeing at the end. So like, let's say someone dies from a car accident, that person would be like, oh, cars should not exist, or no one should ever drive cars because I died from it. And so that has sort of the fear of being irrelevant. And so ways that this sort of plays out is early information about COVID, like at the very start of the lockdown, versus like our current information, and seeing like, it was wrong back then based on what we knew then, but maybe morality can change because it's based on general consensus whether things are wrong now. Some other complications are about risk profiles and certainty of harm. And so just knowing what we know now about COVID and determining like what sort of burdens should be weighed as considering things are wrong. Let's say that a low risk individual, such as someone who is like 20 to 29, who has such a really low case fatality rate as seen in this figure, is facing like a mental health issue, maybe part of this 11% of people that were seriously considering suicide in June. Like that certain sort of harm imposed on that one person maybe might be alleviated by going outside and like sort of disobeying lockdown orders, but that would impose an uncertain, potentially greater risk on other people. And so that's sort of the interplay between like rightness and wrongness and contractualism here. And then we're moving on to moral objectivism.
Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about a different frame of morality in appliance to COVID, and that is moral objectivism, as Lauren said. You can also refer to moral objectivism as objective morality or moral realism, so maybe you've heard of it in those terms. And moral objectivism is the idea that morality is not interpretable and subjective, but that there is like an inherent morality and immorality, meaning that there is a moral code that is innate. So unlike contractualism, where large groups of people agree on morality or individuals agree on their own moral code, moral objectivism sorry, I just got muted a couple times, is the belief that that there is a moral code that no one can disagree or disagree with, because it is innate to, and it just exists. There is no subjective nature to it. And the opposite idea is moral relativism, and that is the idea that morality is interpretable and subjective, so people can determine their own morality and immorality. So contractualism can fall under moral relativism. And many different philosophers believed in moral objectivism and relativism, respectively. Immanuel Kant believed in moral objectivism, for example. So moral objectivism can be applied to COVID-19 in that if there is an innate morality and immorality, then we can use that to help us understand how to navigate our own individual behavior and also our larger behavior, because our actions have morality associated with it. All of our behaviors are inherently moral or immoral. And so one of the really big examples is is non-pharmaceutical interventions, which we had that talk that one of our classmates did. And so those could be considered moral behavior. Those include mask wearing, quarantining, social distancing. So if there is moral objectivism, then we can consider using that to understand if NPIs are moral or immoral behaviors. And it's just a way to help understand individually how to approach using them. But that also is something we're going to discuss later, and we're really excited to hear your thoughts about whether you think they are inherently moral or not. The other thing moral objectivism can help us with in terms of COVID-19 is answering really, really large pivotal questions that we've been struggling with as the world has for months. Because if there is innate like morality and immorality, then we can use those as a guide to answer these questions. So questions like who should get a vaccine first, people are debating endlessly because it is such a complex question. But if there is a clear-cut line of morality, then we can use it to answer, rather than debating like who's at a higher risk, elderly people, people with pre-existing health conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So another question that's pretty large looming is when will it be appropriate to reopen? And that can be on an individual level, like opening your own business, or if you are the president, say, opening a country, or just on a very, very small level. Should I go to this party with 30 people who are going to be unmasked in 4 years? Will we feel appropriate to do that? Or in a year, depending on the news this morning. And then the third question I thought of, although there are many other large looming questions, is how should we recount the pandemic? So that means, like, in the media, there are different portrayals of the pandemic. And if we have an understanding of morality as objective, then we can use it to guide how we portray the pandemic, which is a really, really important thing. We definitely have seen the consequences. We had one of our groups in class present about that exact topic. So it's all three questions and more could be helped to answer by using moral objectivism. And the last thing I want to say is, and it's a little unrelated to moral objectivism, but it's kind of just on the scheme of American morality and philosophy, is that Gallup poll did this interesting poll about Americans' perception of US moral values. And you can kind of see, so the lighter green line is what they perceive American values today. And then the darker green line is what they perceive future morality to be like. And you can see that the future perception is always higher than the current perception, which is interesting to think about. But you can also see that today in 2020, during the pandemic, there is this pretty low idea of what morality looks like in America. And also, the perception of the future is the lowest rated ever since 2002, since the poll started. So if you think about that in terms of COVID, it's and also I wonder what it would be like post this election. There's a lot of different factors going into play, but that's kind of a little unrelated to moral objectivism, just something I think is interesting to think about in terms of morality.
Super. So I just wanted to talk about individualism versus collectivism. So it's the idea of individual versus community needs. When it comes to COVID, a lot of the most effective policies for mitigating COVID-19 have to be reformed by the individual, but sometimes it's not always clear to see that the individual has a direct benefit. So let's just talk about a little bit about what these two terms means. So individualism is the idea that rights and actions of an individual should be free from interference from any organization, which includes government, in the individual's quest to achieve his or her private goals or satisfaction. And individualism in general has been sort of a core facet of American ideology since around the 19th century. And then collectivism is another type of social organization in which the individual is seen as being subordinate to the collective, and the collective could be the state, the nation, or a social class. Those are sort of two contrasting ideals that we're going to be grappling with in a second. And so this is just some interesting things about how collectivism and pathogens in general are related. So societies that have a general prevalence of disease-causing pathogens actually develop collectivist cultures to combat it. And it's because collectivist cultures just have some facets about them which make them sort of, they can deal with like disease-causing pathogens easier. And so we see it here. So they have less contact with foreigners or out-group members. So for them, it's just easier to not be in contact with new disease-causing pathogens. And they also have this idea of tradition and conformity. And a lot of the very specific traditions that a culture develops, for example, food preparation, are actually sometimes created especially to prevent the prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. And if we look at this graph here, and if anybody's interested in the study, it's really, really interesting. And so we see it's plotted historical pathogen prevalence with the incidence of individualism. And you sort of see a very interesting trend. And just in general, collectivist cultures, we perceive them to be better at responding to COVID-19 because they can implement this rapid, wide-reaching collective action. And members in the society usually accept that because they understand, or it is their perception, that the community's needs and the community's benefits go above their own, about their individual needs and benefits. You can go to the next slide, please. Super. And so individualism is also associated with a lot of good things like greater innovation, because in individualist cultures, we sort of see this encouragement to deviate from tradition, from traditional things, from norms. And so innovation is very important for COVID-19 because innovation can bring about vaccines and new MPIs and a lot of very important things. But however, innovation also tends to undermine collective action because we're not focusing on the collective. We're focusing on the rights, the needs, and the comforts of the individual. And that makes the response to COVID-19 complicated. And Lauren, if you could click twice, in this graph, we're seeing individualism on one side, and then COVID-19 deaths per cases on the other. And we see two very individualist countries. We see the US and Great Britain with this data from May, which obviously has changed, but I think it just helps us see it. It helps us put it in perspective. They have a very high score of individualism, but they also have a lot of COVID-19 cases. And if you could click twice again, please. You see South Korea, it's a little hard to see, but it's there, and Japan, which are less individualist countries, and they also have less COVID-19 cases. And I think it helps us think about how individualism and collectivism how they relate to COVID-19 measures, like how we can think about it. And if you can go to the next slide, we're also going to briefly talk about short-term versus long-term. And just in general for COVID-19, there's a lot of ethical dilemmas about short-term versus long-term. For example, this doesn't have to do with the individual, but it's very interesting about triaging. Some countries emphasize who's going to survive in the short term or who's going to survive in the long term. But when it comes to COVID-19, we're thinking about how the individual relates to COVID-19 restrictions. For example, let's think about lockdowns very briefly. In the short term, lockdowns can have very detrimental effects to the individual. They can present impacts on mental health. They can present impact on substance abuse. They can have impacts on the economic situation of an individual. But maybe in the long term, when we look back at it, we go, well, I was exposed less to COVID. Maybe if I had to go to the hospital, they'd have more capacity for me. So it's about grappling with the short-term implications of COVID-19 restrictions versus the long-term. How do these play into these policies? How do the individual think about them?
Awesome. So because we really want a discussion-heavy class today, we're going to just move on to the discussion section already. And our overall goal for this discussion is to use these moral and ethical and philosophical concepts we've just discussed in application to an individual's role during COVID-19. So what do you all think about that? And I'm going to explain the format in a sec, but first we're just going to review the concepts that we've discussed. So we mentioned moral desert, we mentioned a moral conscience, and those two were in the Good Place clip. And Lauren talked briefly about those two. And then he also spoke about contractualism. I spoke about moral objectivism and moral relativism. And Clara spoke about individualism, collectivism, and a short-term, long-term in terms of an individual. So we're going to move on to the questions. And just as a note about how we're intending to lead this discussion, we're thinking of going question by question. And if you want to answer a question, we'd love for you to put your name in the chat, but you also if you do not feel comfortable speaking, which is totally valid, you can just type out your thoughts in the chat and we'll try and read them aloud. I'm going to try and be careful about checking the chat, but we'll see. So the first question, and feel free to also just reflect generally if you feel. So the first question we wanted to ask everyone is, what do you think we owe to each other after watching the clip from The Good Place? And do you agree with Chidi, who is the moral and ethics professor in the clip that Eleanor was watching? So if you want to answer, put your name in the chat. And I'm just going to give you all some time to come up with your thoughts too. All right, sure. I think if Professor Miller would like to answer, that would be wonderful.
Okay, so the question is, what do we owe each other? Does the amount that's in play make any difference in how you answer this question, or is this just independent of what the rewards and costs are?
I don't know, I guess, Lauren, would you like to answer that?
You said, what was the first question?
Well, so the question was, what do we owe each other? And I guess the question becomes, it's easy to be good when the costs to you are low, when you don't really have to do that much, when you are not really suffering that much from doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
How does the cost start to increase? So, to get to the extreme case, if it would significantly harm your family, but significantly help, 1,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
at what point do these things take over? And again, I hope people from the class will join in as well.
I will note that also in The Good Place, somewhat close to this clip, Chidi talks about the trolley problem, where you can choose to kill one person or you can not do anything and kill more people. And so that's also somewhat related, but would love to hear general thoughts.
Mel, you can go ahead.
And I just want to say, I'm very glad you mentioned the trolley problem, because that was something I was thinking of in the background as you, I think, deduced.
Yeah, I think we were contemplating including that. It's just another example in terms of COVID, like medical ethics. When we talked about that in class, it's very deeply related to that as well. But I'm Mellet. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You can go ahead.
Yeah, that's good. I was just gonna say, I guess it depends on your moral stances as an individual, and it depends on like what you believe in. So like, I'm not from the US, but like if I was from the US, for example, I feel like there's like a relatively strong sense of like nationalism there. So if you feel as though you owe something to your fellow citizens because all of you live in the same country and you hold the same values, that kind of stuff, then I would think that that would mean that you would understand that you have a responsibility to do all that you can to keep other people safe. It's kind of the same thing, like if you consider yourself like a very moral person and you view every life as one that deserves to be lived with dignity, or like every life has an equal worth, then it would kind of be the same thing. You would feel as though you owe a responsibility to the people around you to do everything that you can to keep them safe, because everyone's life is as valuable as your own. So why would you not want to do what you can to make sure that you realize that? Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. I think, if anyone else wants to comment on this question, we can totally do that later on if you'd like, but I'm just going to move on to the next question, I think. So the next question as pictured on screen, is contractualism a good basis to determine individual responsibility? And you can think about that in terms of COVID, or you can think about that generally. Obi, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I guess thinking about contractualism, and it kind of relates to a little bit to Malat's point. Actually, I hope I didn't. But if you don't feel that connection with other people, then you might not care about how like how they're doing in life. Like if you don't feel that sense of nationalism or whatever else would bond you to a certain community, then you wouldn't see a need to want to like contribute or help to like or do something that might insignificant or might trouble you a little bit, even though it could help them to a certain degree. So it really depends. Like, I don't know if that of feeling that connection is a good enough basis, just because it depends on how connected people really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a large problem in terms of COVID, because a lot of people feel isolation from others and do not feel that larger connection. Josh, do you want to read your point aloud, or would you like me to read it aloud? Or would you like to speak about your point? Okay, awesome. So Josh said, I think contractualism is an agreeable model, but its main flaw, like many models or theories of morality and behavior, lies in how deeply irrational humans are. I think that's a very interesting point. Lauren or Claire, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's just a good way to sort of be more like holistic about how we review what we use to sort of think about these things. And although contractualism and thinking about what we owe to each other is a great model for how we think about how we deal with COVID measures, I think it's also important to talk about that sometimes we think it's a really good model, but in practice, it's not as clear cut as we think it is. People aren't going to behave necessarily like we think they will.
Yeah, I think as a preface for this whole presentation, which I guess we didn't really include, but one thing that to think about in general is like what Claire was saying, that in practice, a lot of things do not work the way that they do work in theory. And philosophy can often be considered, often relates to that idea, because also with COVID, we see so many discrepancies in how people are affected. So it's easier for some people to believe in contractualism than others, dependent on how disproportionately affected they are. And I think that's really, really important to consider, and that oftentimes philosophers come with a certain level of privilege. So we should consider that. I think, Professor Miller, would you like to ask your question?
I'm happy to, or we could move on to the next one from Isaac.
Sure. Sounds great. Isaac, do you want to go ahead and read that out loud?
It says can't read it right now. So
oh, gotcha. Sorry, I didn't see that.
That just popped up after, so I'll read it. This is another question, but do you think the applicability of contractualism in public health policy may depend on the country? Social responsibility is a lot easier in collectivist countries. So my question is, this country right now, a country that is in itself culturally divided on state lines very strongly, how does one have a contractualism in public health policy?
If you don't mind me tackling that, Leah. We thought about a lot whether or not we could do a very in-depth study about how individualism in the United States affects COVID-19 policies, and like the concept of contractualism might not be as clear-cut in its application in the United States, just because we don't have that mindset of taking care of the collective. We're much more about, the individual's needs, the individual's rights, the individual's personal happiness. And so I think it's going to be a much harder thing to tackle in individualist countries, how we think about these COVID-19 measures. And I don't have an answer for you right now, because it's sort of difficult to conceive, because also individualism, like collectivism, comes on a spectrum. It's a very broad concept, but for more individualist countries, they've had a real issue tackling COVID-19 measures, because this idea that, this lockdown is hurting me, but it might help other people that I can't see or that I can't hear. It's sort of difficult to sort of think about what I owe to these people when it's coming at such harm personally to me. And it's just like, it's a very interesting thing to think about. There's a lot of studies on it about how specifically American individualism hampers our efforts in like dealing with COVID-19 measures that are very stringent.
If anyone else wants to talk about that question, otherwise I'd love to chime in.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead. Maybe we can just, okay, I think Josh is having microphone issues, but Lauren, how about you go first, and then I'll read aloud Josh's point.
Okay, yeah. So the third question that we posed is talking about the group that one uses as a basis, and I think that's like a really key concept of contractualism is mutual recognition, but the mutual recognition of what specific group, right? So if you are in a rural area that doesn't have any COVID cases, and you are getting your home shut down, like your job's taken away, but nothing is harming you, but yet like this government is trying to impose these restrictions on you to do it for the country or whatever, but no one that you know is being affected. Your personal choices like don't make any sense to follow these regulations. Like, do you consider that a wrong action to not go out without a mask or gather in groups, right? Also, like, related to William specifically, maybe like if we're all getting tested and we all have like just like 0 cases on campus, and I'm just seeing Williams people, like, and they all think it's okay too, then like, is that wrong like, I shouldn't consider it wrong under contractualism because no one else considers it wrong, because we don't think anything's wrong with it. But if you go larger out, maybe administration-wise, that's a wrong decision, right? So I think whatever the group is deciding does really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can tackle that question next for everyone, but I just want to read aloud Josh's and Evan's points, unless Evan wants to read aloud their point, whatever Evan wants. But Josh said, I may be grossly misinterpreting what we have discussed, but under this logic, shouldn't we always wear a mask, given that people are always walking around with illnesses, and we've established this belief that wearing a mask is no big deal? Why not wear a mask 24/7 for the rest of humanity? Which I think also goes into play with what Lauren was just talking about, like a group for the rest of humanity is the largest group possible, including like a large variation of people, and that also assumes that there are people walking around with illnesses, as Josh said. So does Evan want to read aloud do you want to read aloud your point, or do you want okay, so I'll read that aloud. Evan said, you seem to be thinking of the interests of the individual as opposed to the interests of the collective, but the collective is composed of individuals. Something that is good for enough individuals would seem to also be good for the collective, by definition. Could this point change your thinking at all? And I think that, I don't know, Clara, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that's sort of, I see that those questions a lot being posed in the media about, well, if mask wearing is the right thing to do, then instead of imposing a mask mandate, we should trust the individual because they'll recognize that it's good for them and it's good for other people. So really, it's a good question to ask. I think it's a better way to view about it as well. And also, I think instead of going by the next couple of questions specifically, if anybody wants to speak to the rest of the questions, that would also be good because I know we're running out of time. So whatever you're most interested in, go ahead, whether as a speaker or through the chat.
KJ, would you like to read that aloud?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
No, I want to talk about moral luck, which means that, whether an action is perceived as moral or not, oftentimes is out of the acting agent's control, often due to chance, or just like the way that the world happens to be. Like, for example, if I had COVID and like I was supposed to be quarantined after traveling, let's say, and I broke quarantine, I think my actions have very different moral implications, like depending on whether or not I infected anyone. Like if there happened to be like an old person, right, that I just happened to cross path with, and I actually ended up, let's say, like killing them, God forbid, I would be judged very harshly. Even though like I could have just not infected them if like that person just happened not to be where I was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also a large part of why COVID is difficult to tackle in terms of like, blanket statements about morality and philosophy, because moral luck is so important. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it also like relates to the like if we want to talk about moral objectivism too, like in that scenario, moral luck doesn't even come into play because there are action, like any action like that would be immoral according to moral objectivism. So I wonder too if people believe that like more how you personally balanced moral luck too, because I think there are certain, probably many instances that you've individually grappled with that for COVID, like Lauren was talking about here. Like, have you gone on a run with someone and demasked who's not in your pod? How did you combat, like how did you play with that in your head? But also feel free to answer the rest of the questions on the side.
I think oftentimes like the way we intuitively deal with this idea is just we try to like estimate our own probabilities. Like we determine our action. Like let's say that like if I violate a certain mandate, and I think like the odds of me getting like actually causing any bad consequences is low, I might just do it. But then the problem with that is that we're actually very poor at doing that. Like we don't have a reliable way to like predict the future, right? So that is problematic in and of itself.
Absolutely. And that also goes into play, like philosophy can be like deeply intertwined with probability and statistics. Like we tried to incorporate that in our presentation, but I think like the idea of individually trying to balance it is inherently mathematical. Professor Miller, if you'd like to pose your question again, or if someone would like to tackle that question, but there's also plenty of questions on the slide, whatever floats your boat.
As long as there are students who are posing questions, I'm happy to let the students go. Students who are lost.
Just relating to the question about individual and community needs, I think it's like pretty interesting if you look at the way that people have treated these NPIs in relation to their political party in the US. Like you can kind of see a trend in what people believe or what political party they affiliate themselves with kind of determined how they went about treating the pandemic and whether or not they were gonna kind of like wear a mask and social distance and that kind of stuff. So just going back to that thing about like probability, I think that that's kind of something that maybe you could have seen happening. Obviously, you would think to like associate the right wing more with like individualism and kind of making sure that you put yourself first, when you'd probably associate the left wing more with kind of like collectivism and that kind of stuff. So seeing how that has played out is also something that's interesting to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just going to read aloud Isaac's point. An attachment to my last question, is education the answer to a greater sense of moral responsibility? I mean, education for young kids. I have seen this aversion to wearing masks associated with a distrust of science and science as an institution. So that's why I ask, what could the role of elementary or middle school public education be in matters of public health policy success?
So this is actually kind of a response to Josh's point from before about like why not wear a mask 24/7? And I think that's actually a valid question to bring up at this point, but I guess my only response would be like what illnesses would you actually be trying, like imagine if COVID didn't exist, of course. What illnesses would you actually be trying to prevent? Like how many airborne sicknesses with a high or like a medium mortality rate would the mask actually be preventing? Of course, this is a world where COVID doesn't exist. That would legitimately like reason that you should wear a mask like 24/7 for the rest of your existence. So that would be like the only response I have to that.
Do you have anything in response to that, Josh? Because I wonder if you mean like in outside of COVID, if you also mean that, like Obi was talking about. Sure, Professor Miller, you can go ahead too.
Okay, so this ties in with the conversation we've had before about slippery slopes, in terms of, wearing a mask and what that can do. How far does it go? Who makes the final decision? Do individuals have a choice? Do they have the ability to make certain decisions and accept the costs? But what happens when the costs don't impact just themselves? So I think in the last class, we talked about secondhand smoke versus wearing a helmet when you ride a motorcycle. And I think those two are very different cases in that secondhand smoke will impact someone else, whereas the motorcycle rider who does not have on a helmet, the question becomes if they get in an accident, who pays for it? Do you create a society then where you turn people away from emergency rooms if they do not have enough healthcare coverage to pay for something like that, and that's their choice? But at what point do individuals have a choice of what they want to do? And who are the ones who are tasked, and can we believe that these people will be impartial, pure science, not motivated by any individual passions, that when they put on their medical smocks, their research robes, their judicial garments, that they put their individual preferences down and look at facts impartially?
I think that's also an excellent point in terms of what I was saying earlier about the nature of using philosophy and morality and ethics to examine COVID, because there are so many exceptions to these cases. Like there are people who just do not have an ability to make individual choices in this pandemic, and they're not going to be able to use these frameworks that we've been discussing. So it's really also important to remember that. I think so. We have a minute left, so if anyone else wants to say anything about any questions, feel free to do so. And if not, thank you very much. It was a really, really interesting conversation, and we hope that you, got a little something about philosophy and application to COVID.
So thank you very much. I will just end building on your last comment, that not every individual is in the same situation as every other, and the choices that one group makes are going to be very different. And so there are some people, my wife and I are fortunate, we're professors. We almost left Williams because my wife was initially teaching across the state, but she fortunately got a job at UMass. We could have gone to another school where we both would have had jobs. We decided to stay here and have her commute 90 minutes, but she no longer commutes 90 minutes because it's COVID. And so for us, the choices are not that difficult. But for other people, when you read about the impact this is having on various sectors of the economy and the people who actually need their jobs to work in person, when you look at what's happening with the childcare and the frontline workers who have no one to watch their children, it's not the same. It may be the same question, but it's not the same resources for everyone. And so to me, it's very interesting watching how these questions unfold and what we do to help the groups that need it the most. So thank you again.